The teenager was exhausted. It had been a long shift at the small grocery store where she worked part-time after school. The aisles were quiet now, the fluorescent lights buzzing softly above her as she gathered stray carts from the parking lot. The evening air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of rain, and she pulled her jacket tighter around her. She had just finished returning the last cart when she noticed him. An elderly man, slightly hunched, struggling with two heavy grocery bags. He moved slowly, carefully, his worn-out cap pulled low over his eyes. Something about him seemed familiar, but she couldn't quite place it. Without hesitation, she hurried over. "Here, let me help you with that," she said, reaching for one of the bags. The man looked up, his deep-set eyes studying her for a moment. Then, he nodded. "That's mighty kind of you," he said, his voice low and gravelly. She took the bags from him and walked alongside him toward his car, an old but well-kept vehicle that didn't quite match his rugged appearance. She placed the bags in the trunk, stepping back with a polite smile. "No problem," she said. "Have a good night." She was about to turn away when he called out to her. "Wait." She paused as he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. His hands, aged but steady, extended it toward her. "What's this?" she asked, hesitating. "Just a little something," he said, a strange glint in his eyes. "For your kindness." She didn't know what to say. Tips weren't allowed at the store, and even if they were, she wasn't expecting anything in return. It was just a habit, helping people who needed it. Still, she took the note with a polite nod. "Thank you," she said, tucking it into her pocket without looking at it. The man gave her a small smile, then got into his car. The engine rumbled to life, and just like that, he was gone. She didn't think much of it as she finished her shift, clocking out and heading home. It was just another long day in a long string of them, and she was too tired to dwell on anything. It wasn't until later that night, as she emptied her pockets, that she remembered the note. She unfolded the paper casually at first. Then, her hands froze. Her breath caught in her throat as she read the words scrawled across the paper in neat, unmistakable handwriting. Her eyes widened. Her heart pounded in her chest. This couldn't be real. Her hands began to tremble. And then, before she even realized it, tears were spilling down her cheeks. She reread the note, over and over, trying to make sense of it. Because what was written on that paper was about to change her life forever. The girl's hands trembled as she held the note. Her eyes scanned the words again, her mind refusing to believe what she was seeing. It was a short message, written in simple, neat handwriting. "Kindness never goes unnoticed. Meet me at the address below tomorrow at 7 p.m. No pressure, just a conversation. You might find it worth your time." At the bottom of the note was an address. Her heart pounded in her chest. Who was that man? Why had he given her this? And why did his voice, his presence, seem so familiar? She grabbed her phone and typed the address into the search bar. A moment later, her screen refreshed, and what she saw made her breath hitch. The location wasn't a restaurant, a cafe, or even a public place. It was a private estate. A gated property in one of the wealthiest parts of the city. Her stomach twisted. This had to be a mistake. She thought back to the man at the store, his rugged appearance, the way he carried himself. He had looked old, tired, but there had been something almost powerful about him. And then it hit her. Her eyes widened. Her breath came faster. Clint Eastwood. She shot up from her bed, pacing the small room she shared with her younger sister. Could it really have been him? The legendary actor, director, and Hollywood icon? No, no way. She quickly searched his name, scrolling through photos of him over the years. As she came across a more recent picture, her stomach flipped. The sharp jawline, the squinting eyes, the familiar deep-set wrinkles, it was him. She sank onto her bed, gripping the note tightly. Why would Clint Eastwood, a man who had met thousands of people, who had walked red carpets and directed blockbuster movies, take an interest in her? A struggling teenage girl who worked at a grocery store? Her mother's voice called from the kitchen, snapping her out of her thoughts. Dinner's ready. She shoved the note into her pocket and forced herself to move. As she sat at the table, pushing food around her plate, her mother noticed something was off. You okay, sweetheart? She hesitated. Then, pulling the note from her pocket, she slid it across the table. Her mother picked it up, eyes scanning the words. Her face shifted from confusion to concern. Who gave you this? She asked. The girl swallowed. An old man at the store. I helped him carry his groceries. I didn't recognize him at first, but... Mom, I think it was Clint Eastwood. Her mother's eyebrows shot up. Clint Eastwood? The actor? She nodded. Her mother sighed, setting the note down. I don't know, baby. This could be some kind of mistake. Or worse, a setup. I thought that too, she admitted. But I looked up the address. It's real. And the way he acted. I don't know, Mom. It felt different. Her mother studied her carefully. And you're thinking about going? She hesitated. I don't know. Silence filled the room. Then, her mother leaned forward, her voice soft but serious. Honey, I know you're curious. And maybe this is something big. But you have to be careful. The world isn't always kind, especially to girls like us. She understood what her mother meant. She had learned early on that life didn't hand out opportunities to people like them. Hard work, struggle, sacrifice, that was all she had known. But something inside her whispered that this was different. What if this really was Clint Eastwood? What if he saw something in her? What if this was the one break she had been waiting for? She took a deep breath. I think I want to go. Her mother's lips pressed into a thin line. Finally, she sighed. Then I'll drive you. And if anything feels off, we're leaving. Relief flooded her chest. Okay. That night, as she lay in bed, she stared at the ceiling, heart racing. Tomorrow, she would step into a world far different from her own. And she had no idea what was waiting for her on the other side. The next day, the girl could barely focus at school. Her mind kept drifting back to the note, the address, and the man she had met at the grocery store. She still wasn't sure if she was making the right decision, but something deep inside told her she had to see this through. By the time school ended, her nerves were getting the best of her. Her mother picked her up from work that evening, just like she promised. The drive to the address on the note was quiet. The girl stared out the window, watching as the scenery changed from crowded streets and small businesses to wide roads lined with towering trees and grand houses that looked like they belonged in movies. When they finally pulled up to the gate of the estate, her mother gripped the steering wheel a little tighter. This is the place, she asked, her voice laced with caution. The girl nodded, suddenly feeling very small. A security guard stepped out of a booth near the gate and approached the car. Her mother rolled down the window. Can I help you? The guard asked, his tone polite but firm. The girl's hands were sweaty as she held up the note. I was invited here, she said nervously. The guard took the paper, glanced at it, then gave her a knowing look. Without another word, he stepped back and pressed a button. The gate slowly creaked open. Drive straight up, he instructed. They're expecting you. Her mother gave her a worried glance, but put the car in drive. The long driveway led to a massive house, more like a mansion, with a large fountain in front. The girl felt like she had stepped into another world. As they parked, she turned to her mother. Are you coming in with me? Her mother hesitated, looking up at the house. I think this is something you need to do on your own, she said carefully. But if you don't come back in an hour, I'm coming in after you. The girl swallowed hard, nodded, and stepped out of the car. As she approached the entrance, the heavy wooden doors opened before she could knock. A man in a suit, probably a butler, gave her a warm smile. This way, he said, leading her through a grand hallway filled with paintings, awards, and movie memorabilia. She barely had time to take it all in before they reached a quiet sitting room. And there, standing by a fireplace, was the man from the grocery store. Clint Eastwood. Without the old cap and sunglasses, he was unmistakable. Even at his age, he had the same presence that made him a legend. "Glad you came," he said, his voice just as deep and gravelly as she remembered. She hesitated, unsure of what to say. I wasn't sure if I should." He chuckled, motioning for her to sit. "I don't blame you. Must have been quite a surprise." She nodded, her hands gripping the chair's armrests. "Why am I here?" she finally asked. Clint studied her for a moment, then sat across from her. "I've met a lot of people in my life," he said. "Some good, some bad. But every now and then, you come across someone who reminds you of something important." She tilted her head. "What do you mean?" "You didn't hesitate to help me," he said simply. "Didn't expect anything in return. That kind of kindness is rare these days." She shrugged, unsure of how to respond. It was the right thing to do." He smiled. "Exactly. And that's the kind of person who deserves a chance." Her heart started to race. "A chance?" He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Tell me about yourself. What do you want out of life?" The question caught her off guard. No one had ever really asked her that before. Not in a way that made it seem like the answer actually mattered. She hesitated, then took a deep breath. "I want to go to college," she admitted. "I want to do something meaningful. Maybe study business or law. But money's tight. I work after school to help my mom, and even with scholarships, it's not enough." Clint listened carefully, nodding. "That's a tough road." She nodded. "Yeah. But I don't have a choice." He was quiet for a moment, then reached into his pocket and pulled out another folded piece of paper. "Take this," he said, handing it to her. Her fingers shook as she unfolded it. At first, she didn't understand what she was looking at. Then, as the words registered, her breath caught in her throat. It was a check. A check made out in her name. For $50,000. Her head snapped up. I can't take this," she stammered. He smiled. "Yes, you can." Tears burned at the corners of her eyes. "But why? You don't even know me." He leaned back in his chair. "Because once upon a time, someone helped me when I had nothing," he said. "And I never forgot it. Now, I'm just passing it forward." Her vision blurred with tears as she looked down at the check again. This money, this gift, meant everything. It meant a future she had never thought possible. "Thank you," she whispered, barely able to speak. Clint Eastwood simply smiled. "Make it count." The check trembled in her hands. $50,000. More money than she had ever seen in her life. More than her mother made in a year. It didn't feel real. She looked up at Clint Eastwood, his expression calm, patient. As if he knew exactly what was running through her mind. I don't know what to say," she finally whispered, her voice barely holding steady. "You don't have to say anything," Clint said. "Just promise me you'll use it well." She swallowed hard. "I will. I swear I will." But even as she said it, doubt crept in. Why her? Why this? It didn't make sense. Her fingers curled around the check. "I don't deserve this," she admitted, shaking her head. "There are people who need it more. People who—" "Stop." His voice was firm, but kind. She looked up, startled. Clint leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Do you know how many times I've heard people say that? That they don't deserve something good? That someone else should have it instead?" She stayed silent. "You worked for this," he continued. "Maybe not in a way you expected, but you did. You didn't hesitate to help me. You treated me like a regular person, not some celebrity. That tells me something about you. Her throat tightened. I just did what anyone would do. No, you didn't. Clint shook his head. A lot of people walked past me that day. Some stared, some ignored me. You didn't. You stepped up. And that tells me you have something that can't be taught, character. She felt her eyes sting again. She wasn't used to hearing things like this. Most of her life had been filled with people telling her what she couldn't do. How life was unfair, how she had to accept that some things just weren't meant for people like her. But here was Clint Eastwood, one of the most famous men in the world, telling her she was worthy. That she deserved this. She took a shaky breath. What if I mess this up? Clint chuckled, leaning back in his chair. Then you learn. And you try again. She let those words settle in. For the first time in a long time, she felt something new, hope. She wiped her eyes quickly, not wanting to cry in front of him. Can I ask you something? Of course. Why are you doing this? Clint smiled, as if he had been expecting the question. He turned slightly, glancing at an old photograph sitting on the mantel. It was a black and white picture of a young man, no older than 20, standing beside a battered old car. That's me, he said, nodding toward the photo. She squinted, barely recognizing him. You look different. I was broke, he said with a chuckle. Trying to make it in Hollywood, working odd jobs just to eat. There were times I thought about giving up. She listened, completely drawn in. There was this old diner I used to go to. I'd buy a cup of coffee and stretch it out for hours, because I couldn't afford anything else. He exhaled softly. One night, I was sitting there, feeling pretty low. Wondering if I'd ever make it. And then the owner, a guy named Joe, sat down across from me. She leaned forward. What did he say? He didn't say much at first. Just slid a plate of food in front of me and said, eat up. It's on the house. Clint smiled at the memory. I told him I couldn't pay, and he just waved it off. Said, doesn't matter. Just remember, when you're in a position to help someone else, don't think twice. The girl felt goosebumps rise on her arms. I never forgot that, Clint said. Years later, when I finally made it in the industry, I went back to that diner. Joe was older then, but he remembered me. I tried to pay him back, but he just laughed. Said he didn't do it for money. She swallowed hard, hanging on to every word. I realized then that life isn't just about what we achieve. It's about how we give back, Clint continued. So I made a promise to myself, I'd always look for ways to help people who reminded me of where I came from. He met her gaze. And you, kid, you remind me of me. A lump formed in her throat. Clint stood up, stretching slightly. Now, I don't expect anything in return. You don't have to become famous or rich. Just, do something good with this. Help someone else one day, the way Joe helped me. She nodded quickly, gripping the check tightly. I will. Good. He smiled. Then my job here is done. The girl stood too, still overwhelmed. I don't know how to thank you. Clint laughed. You already did. A knock on the door interrupted them. The butler stepped in. Sir, her ride is waiting. The girl turned toward the door, then back to Clint. I won't forget this. I know you won't. He gave her a wink. Now go make something of yourself. She walked out of that mansion a different person than when she entered. Her mother was waiting in the car, eyes full of worry. As soon as she slid into the passenger seat, her mother asked, well? The girl took a deep breath and held up the check. Her mother's eyes widened in shock. Oh my God. Tears welled up again, but this time, they weren't from fear or doubt. This time, they were from possibility. Because for the first time in her life, the future finally felt within reach. The drive home was quiet, but not in an uncomfortable way. It was the kind of silence that came when words simply weren't enough. The girl sat in the passenger seat, staring down at the check in her hands, her fingers tracing over the ink as if it might disappear at any moment. Her mother's knuckles were white against the steering wheel. She had barely spoken since seeing the check, except for the occasional glance at her daughter, as if making sure this wasn't a dream. Finally, as they pulled into their driveway, her mother turned off the car and exhaled slowly. "Are you sure this is real?" The girl let out a small laugh, though it was shaky. "I think so." Her mother turned to her, searching her face. "What happened in there?" The girl hesitated, then told her everything, about Clint Eastwood's story, the diner owner, and how he saw something in her that reminded him of himself. How he believed in passing kindness forward. Her mother listened quietly, her expression unreadable. But when the girl finished, her mother sighed and ran a hand through her hair. "I don't even know what to say." "Me neither," the girl admitted. For a long moment, they just sat there. Then, finally, her mother shook her head. "Come on. Let's go inside." As soon as they stepped through the front door, her younger sister ran up to them. "Where did you go?" "What happened?" she asked excitedly. The girl looked at her mother before responding. "Something crazy." She handed the check to her mother, who placed it on the kitchen table as if it were made of glass. They all stared at it. $50,000, her sister whispered, eyes wide. "What are you going to do with it?" That was the question, wasn't it? Even though Clint had told her the money was for her education, the girl couldn't help but think of all the other things it could help with. Their rent was always late. Their car was barely holding together. Her mother worked 2 jobs, just to keep food on the table. Would it be selfish to use the money for school when her family needed it just as much? As if reading her mind, her mother placed a hand on her shoulder. "This is your opportunity," she said firmly. "Clint Eastwood gave this to you for a reason. Don't waste it worrying about things we've already learned to survive without." Tears burned in the girl's eyes. "But, Mom." Her mother squeezed her shoulder. "We'll be fine. You need to go after what you want." The girl nodded slowly, swallowing hard. She had dreamed of college for so long, but had never thought it was possible. Now, for the first time, it felt within reach. Later that night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her mind raced. What if she failed? What if this was all a mistake? Then she remembered Clint's words, "Then you learn. And you try again." She let out a breath and closed her eyes. Tomorrow, she would start figuring out the next steps. Tomorrow, everything would change. The next few weeks were a blur. She met with college advisors, looked at tuition costs, and filled out applications. With the check, she could afford her first 2 years at a good school, especially with the scholarships she had already earned. She also made sure to write Clint a letter, thanking him for what he had done. She didn't expect a reply, he was a busy man, but it felt important to let him know that she wouldn't waste the opportunity he had given her. One day, as she was finalizing her enrollment papers, she received an unexpected package in the mail. It had no return address, but when she opened it, her breath caught. Inside was a framed photograph. It was an old picture of Clint Eastwood, standing outside that diner from his story. But this time, there was something new. Across the bottom of the image, written in bold, unmistakable handwriting, were the words, "Remember to pay it forward." She clutched the frame to her chest, tears spilling down her cheeks. She would. One day, when she was in a position to help someone the way Clint had helped her, she would. Because kindness never goes unnoticed, the framed photo of Clint Eastwood and the words, "Remember to pay it forward," sat on the girl's desk, a constant reminder that her life had changed forever. But with change came challenges, and the road ahead was anything but smooth. As the first semester of college approached, reality hit hard. The money Clint had given her covered tuition, books, and part of her living expenses, but there were still struggles. Rent was high, food wasn't cheap, and despite her mother's encouragement to focus on school, she couldn't ignore the financial burden her family still carried. So, she made a choice. Between classes and studying, she picked up a part-time job at a cafe near campus. It wasn't glamorous, she spent most of her shifts making coffee and cleaning tables, but it helped. Some nights, exhaustion weighed her down, making it hard to concentrate on her assignments. There were moments of doubt when she wondered if she was truly cut out for this. If she deserved to be here. One particular night, after an exhausting shift, she sat in the library, staring at an open textbook, but the words blurred together. Her mind drifted back to Clint's story, how he had struggled, how he had almost given up. Then you learn. And you try again. She took a deep breath, refocused, and pushed through. Weeks turned into months. Slowly but surely, she adjusted. She found a rhythm, balancing work, classes, and studying. And despite the hardships, something incredible was happening, she was growing. For the first time in her life, she wasn't just surviving. She was becoming. One chilly evening, she was working at the cafe when an older man walked in. He looked tired, worn down by life. His clothes were clean but well used, and there was something in his eyes, something familiar. He hesitated near the counter, looking at the menu as if he was trying to figure out what he could afford. She knew that look. Without thinking twice, she walked over with a warm smile. "Cold out there tonight, huh?" The man nodded, stuffing his hands into his jacket pockets. "Yeah. Feels like winter's coming early this year." She glanced at the menu, then back at him. "What can I get you?" He hesitated. "Just a small coffee." She could tell that was all he was planning to get. Probably all he could afford. "Tell you what," she said, grabbing a cup. "We have a special today, coffee and a sandwich, on the house." His eyes flickered with surprise. "Are you sure?" She grinned. "Absolutely. But there's one condition." He raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" She handed him the coffee and the sandwich, then leaned slightly forward. "When you're in a position to help someone else, don't think twice." For a moment, he just stared at her. Then, slowly, he smiled, a small, grateful smile. "I won't forget this," he murmured. She nodded. "Good." As he took a seat by the window, something inside her shifted. This was what Clint had meant. It wasn't about grand gestures or massive amounts of money. It was about recognizing the moment when someone needed kindness and stepping up, without hesitation, without expectation. And so, as she cleaned up at the end of her shift, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. A sense of purpose. The days grew colder, and so did the challenges of balancing college, work, and family. But the girl had changed. She was no longer the same person who hesitated to believe in herself. She had made a promise, to Clint, to herself, and now, to the world. She would pay it forward. One evening, she was heading home from a late-night study session at the library when she saw a familiar sight. A young woman, probably in her early 20s, was sitting alone on a bus stop bench. Her shoulders were hunched, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, as if she were trying to disappear. It was the same look the girl had once carried, the weight of worry, of uncertainty, of feeling like the world was closing in. The girl hesitated for only a second before walking over. "Hey," she said gently. The woman looked up, startled. Her eyes were red, as if she had been crying. "You okay?" the girl asked. The woman sniffled and wiped her face quickly. "Yeah, I'm fine." The girl recognized the lie instantly. She glanced down and noticed a backpack at the woman's feet. A cheap blanket was sticking out of the zipper. Homeless. She knew that reality all too well. She had never been on the streets, but there were nights when she had wondered if her family would end up there. "You hungry?" the girl asked. The woman hesitated. I don't have any money." "I didn't ask that," the girl said with a small smile. The woman blinked, clearly caught off guard. "There's a diner down the street," the girl continued. "Come on." "I was about to grab something to eat anyway." The woman studied her face, as if trying to decide whether to trust her. Finally, after a long pause, she nodded. The warmth of the diner was a sharp contrast to the cold outside. They slid into a booth, and the girl watched as the woman hesitantly glanced at the menu. "Order whatever you want," the girl said. The woman bit her lip. "Just coffee is fine." The girl shook her head. "Nope. You're getting real food." After some hesitation, the woman finally ordered a sandwich. When it arrived, she ate slowly, as if savoring every bite. After a few minutes of silence, the woman finally spoke. "My name's Ava," she said. The girl smiled. "Nice to meet you, Ava." Ava took a deep breath. I lost my job a few weeks ago. Couldn't keep up with rent. My roommates kicked me out. Been trying to find work, but it's hard without an address." The girl nodded, listening carefully. "I don't want to be a burden," Ava continued, her voice breaking. "I don't want to beg. I just don't know what to do anymore." The girl understood that feeling too well. She reached into her bag, pulled out a piece of paper, and wrote something down. "There's a shelter a few blocks from here," she said, sliding the paper across the table. "They help with job placement too." Ava looked at it, her hands shaking. "Why are you doing this?" The girl smiled, the memory of Clint Eastwood's voice echoing in her mind. "Because someone once did the same for me." Ava stared at her for a long moment. Then, tears welled up in her eyes. She wiped them away quickly and whispered, "Thank you." The girl simply nodded. Because this wasn't about getting thanks. It was about paying it forward. And she knew, deep in her heart, that Ava would do the same for someone else one day.